The sun has left and forgotten.
Your stories don't
me.
define you,
It's
but how you
dark,
tell them
I
will.
cannot
I'm Sarah Elkins,
see.
your host and chief
Why
storymaker at
does this
Elkins
rain pour
Consulting.
down? I'm
If
gonna
you've listened to any of
drown
these episodes, you
in
know
a
that the important thing to me
sea
is hearing
of
other people's stories
tears
and
and
helping them understand how important they are, not only for their own sharing and being able to inspire others, but also to address some of those internal messages that sometimes hold us back. I'm so eager to have the conversation today with my friend George Schunk. I met him through our mutual friend, Chip Clausen, who is a phenomenal artist, and I interviewed him on my podcast a few years back. Um, Chip Clausen had an art opening in Great Falls, Montana at the Paris Gibson Art Center, and it was an extraordinary display of Chip's ceramic and multimedia art. And George happened to be one of his volunteers to help him set it up. And it was, we'll include a picture of it in the show notes associated with this podcast episode so you can see a little bit more of what Chip Clausen does. But in the meantime, had just the beginning of a conversation with George and realized, oh my gosh, this guy has awesome stories, and our listeners are going to have so much fun with this. So, George, thank you for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start by the question that you knew I was going to ask. I'd love to hear something about you that most people might not know about you. And I asked that question so that we have more context for who you are as the complex human being that you are and not get stuck in one part of your life. So, what do you think? What are you going to share with us?
Right. Well, thanks for the opportunity. The uh, the one thing that probably a lot of my friends would not know about me unless I uh, told them an anecdote or two is that I am very sentimental and nostalgic, and it kind of in the course of writing in the last couple of years, I had occasion to go back through my files. I have been a saver. Uh, it's incredible, whether it's, something that a girlfriend in high school gave me, uh, letters that I exchanged with people when I was early in college, or really detailed back and forth kind of logistical letters that my climbing partners wrote to me about some expedition they were planning. They wanted me to join, and what I'd be expected to bring to the trip. I saved it all, and it was almost as if someone was going to badger me about writing a biography late in my life, or that I was gonna become someone famous where I'd have my own archival library, because I ended up with all this stuff in my storage locker in Oregon, in Washington, D.C., and in Montana. So when I started to go back and try to kind of think about my life and make a timeline for where I was when, who I was with, what I did, I started by kind of organizing all these little objects that um, people had sent me or given me over time, and uh, they really became kind of the factual base for, uh, I guess, telling my stories.
Wow. You're right. Just on the surface of it, I can't imagine most of us would know that about you because you've moved around so much and you don't stay in one place for very long. The fact that you've collected these items and held on to them for decades, it is pretty surprising.
Yeah, there were. I think I probably had a good like 8 boxes that maybe with when I went through and organized them, I brought it down to four. And I mean, there were hundreds of people in there that I ended up creating files for, and reading those letters, reading those the memorabilia, uh, putting it on a timeline. Uh, and um, yeah, those boxes moved across the United States at least twice, and now they're kind of a valuable resource.
Wow. Wow. I keep coming back to this idea of going through those. I call them memory boxes. I have a couple too. And the difference between saving those versus saving uh, things, large things, things that you can't put inside a small box or medium-sized box. So I could see your wheels turning. Like you have particular things that you're visualizing when you're saying that. Is there anything in particular that you like something a girlfriend in high school gave you? Is that one of the items that pops into your head when you think of those boxes?
Well, right. I mean, for the most part, it's correspondence. They're letters. That's what they are. They're also my journal notes. Uh, Early on some of my first expeditions out of the United States, I knew I was doing something significant. I was young. Someone probably gave me a blank like a journal,
Mhm.
and I kept a journal of what was going on, the weather in the mountains, uh, who was doing what, notable events, the high points, the low points. And so I had kind of those kind of like diaries, I guess you'll say, and you can say, but a lot of it was external correspondence. And then of course, I documented with photographs, everything basically I did, and I'm still documenting with it's only become easier to document.
Of course.
So uh, you can become overwhelmed by that, but I was an organizer. I had kind of an analytical approach to things, kind of a Excel spreadsheet kind of a guy. And so I was able, using the indexes to my photographs, my transparencies, my slides, and then later my digital copies, I was able to kind of uh, create a timeline that was factual, and all it was like a jigsaw puzzle that kind of where I started, the more stuff I got and the more detailed my timeline became, uh, it's almost my life came into focus. But you're right. I was thinking about a little. I had a memento that's now in the side compartment of my Prius. It travels around with me, and it's a little leather bound book of poems, kind of like Wordsworth, Henry David Thoreau. That, yeah, when I was 16, my 15-year-old girlfriend gave me, and it's bound in leather on parchment paper. And it's like I pulled it out this summer to show my son, you know, who's now 19, you know, what I was retaining, these little kind of
Wow.
talismans or
What
mementos.
was
Yeah.
what was his response to that little
He didn't have much of a
poetry book?
response. He didn't have much of a response. It didn't mean much to him. It's kind of
Oh,
one of those dad moments when,
look at
yeah,
what I still
there's,
have from when I was, younger than you are now.
yeah, you have to be kind of nostalgic or sentimental to appreciate some of that stuff. But uh, while I have thrown out a lot, I'm I've I've kind of organized and kept that stuff.
The things that keep coming back to me are this idea of sentimentality and having that sense of nostalgia, being able to focus that on journals and correspondence as opposed to stuff, right? Um, the reason this keeps coming back to me is that I interviewed a woman named Lisa Weiss about her podcast called The Object Diaries. And she gets people to talk about an object that would be kind of secret to them, that people would look at and wouldn't have any idea of the sentimental or nostalgic value of it. And her story starts with a conversation with her father, who passed away shortly after she had this conversation with him about a little, I think it's a cigar box with toys, just a handful of small toys that he had as a child that he held on to into his 70s. And we talked about how you can have an object that has so much deep meaning to it. So first, I think your son may appreciate it a lot more in 10 years. At 19, he's probably thinking, "I don't wanna have to go through that when you die." Can you please even go down further from your 6 boxes down to 4, down to 2? Maybe just have 1 left for me. Um, but the other thing that I keep coming back to is that he'll probably be more interested in it later on when he starts feeling nostalgia. At 19, he probably doesn't have quite the same connection to certain things. I don't know, what do you think?
Right. Well, yeah, that's interesting. I I own no real estate. I own no home, whether it's in the United States or here in Colombia. I When I was married in my kind of mid 40s to mid 50s, I co-owned a home with my wife in Portland. But that went with the divorce. And kind of intentionally, I've stayed away from ownership of realty, basically. And so my friends down here in Colombia always ask me, they're sure I have a home up in the United States. And they ask me why I don't buy a home down here in Colombia. And truth be told, I probably could afford a home here, but I'm not big on realty. I really kind of have feelings about ownership and how none of us should really own the land. But I do own a storage locker. I rent a storage locker in East Helena. And I'm pretty proud of that storage locker. In fact, you mentioned Chip, our mutual friend, and Chip helped me a few years ago build shelving in there. And so it's pretty well organized. I've got 2 kayaks hung up. I've got some art on the walls. I've got filing cabinets, and I've got all these boxes, and actually a great deal of pretty valuable winter climbing clothing, climbing equipment, every kind of sports equipment imaginable, skateboards, uh, golf clubs, and 4 snowboards, and I'm kind of proud of it. And when I opened that bodega, as they call them in Spanish, but that storage locker for George this summer, kind of, expecting him to be impressed, the first words out of his mouth were, "What am I going to do with all that stuff?"
So I called it. I totally called that. So George is your son.
George is my 19-year-old son.
Okay. That is hilarious. I know, as a woman in my mid-50s with 2 boys out of the house, a lot of what I think about is clearing out clutter and trying not to hold on to things. And it's gotten progressively better, and my mom is doing the same thing because she had to clean out her mom's old stuff with her siblings, and so she is very slowly trying to get rid of stuff too. But I love that you associate, um, all of that correspondence and journals as your, um, almost linear approach to nostalgia and sentimentality. And the reason it makes me smile is that I have this memory box in our basement here in Helena, and, years back, I went through it, and I found this little piece of paper. It's maybe 2 inches by 4 inches. I mean, it's a little piece of paper, and it says, "Will you kiss me? Love, Brian." And it was a boy in 5th grade that I loved when I went to school in California. I was in elementary school near LA, and I found that. The reason I went through it to find that piece of paper was because I met his older brother randomly in Denver. And
Yeah,
that
there you go.
weird connection, right? And that why was I holding on to this little piece of paper? I wasn't in touch with the guy anymore. It didn't affect my life as far as I know. So, I love the idea of the journals. Was there anything that you read? Because 'Cause you've been going back through so much. What's one thing that you read that you're still thinking about?
Uh, well, a lot of this is deeply personal, Sarah. And it's, uh, I was lucky in love in my life. I spent, I had a lot of good companionship with women. I spent some of the best times of my life accompanied by women, living with women. And as opposed to kind of, I guess, the dominant paradigm where you get married in your 20s and kind of start a family. Um, Maybe you buy a home together. Uh, that's the mortgage, your children, uh, planning for retirement, these kind of things. Um, I kind of opted out early on that paradigm. I fell in with a group of young climbers. I mean, they were 35. I was 16. They worked at an architectural firm that I had expressed to my dad. I was kind of demonstrating some independence, wildness, uh, drinking. I had quit playing competitive tennis. I had a pretty good run at that. And I was just kind of girl crazy. I was starting to drink and smoke weed. And so my dad was a little concerned. And when I expressed an interest in architecture, he arranged for me to have an intern, or kind of like I was an office boy for a
Mhm.
friend of his, a neighbor. And I went down there after school, after high school, and kind of run blueprints, spec books, did whatever needed done in the office. In so doing, I got to meet some draftsmen, and these were men that were not my father. They were about 35, and they were single guys and kind of had an average job, and they climbed on the weekends in this climbing club. And so my takeaway from 2 years working in this architectural firm was not that I was going to continue in architecture, because quite frankly, drafting was kind of tedious, kind of
Mhm.
mundane work, repetitious. But they told me, George, one, when you turn 16, come to our climbing school. Uh, you're too young now, but next year you'll be old enough. And two, whatever you do, don't get married till you're 35. Okay, so I
And this was in the late '70s, right? Early '80s?
this was in the 60s. Sarah,
'60s, okay.
I, I'm 72, so I've
Oh,
got
right.
probably 20 years on you. And and yeah, there was just a lot of, I mean, there's such a subtle in our culture, our American culture, uh, kind of pressure on what you need. You
Right.
need a companion, you need to go to college, you need to save for retirement, whatever. And I constantly push back against all that. And this whole joining the Sandy M Alpine Club, and I took that to heart. I didn't get married till I was 49. And and it's a little bit like people say, George, don't you get lonely in Colombia? And I, while I'm down here by myself, it doesn't mean I'm
By yourself,
I'm
alone.
by
Right,
myself alone.
right.
And that's never been the case in my life. That's why I said I'm kind of lucky in love. I've had some great companions. And I guess this kind of winds back to the question about, what I've learned by going back through that correspondence, and is there anything that I've read that really stood out? And I guess one of the things that kind of comes back to me is that after all this, um, I guess, independence or serial monogamy that I enjoyed, um, it, before I started to write about my life, I wondered to myself, was I fair to the women that I loved and I lived with? Because so often, uh, my free spirit, my independence wasn't shared by the women that I lived with or I loved. They wanted to get married. They wanted to have children. But I, in my inimical way, just kind of continued to Well, I treated every relationship as it potentially could go permanent. Often what happened, it is sentimentality and I kind of have a fickle heart, things would change.
Mhm.
And I would hear something else calling. And uh, the women that I was with, they never overlapped. I was faithful. But it was, there were, I had a lot of experience. And so I wondered whether I treated women fairly. And I was big on communication. I had a lot of counseling, partners counseling, couples counseling. That was all very valuable. But I always enjoyed, and the things that have kind of stuck in my head and what I've read is when someone wrote a letter years later about even though we had broken up, I had gone on, they had gone on. It they're letters that kind of acknowledge that what we had was special, what we had was valuable, and you know if you're swinging for the fences or you're measuring relationships by whether they end in marriage and permanence and those
Mhm.
kind of things, uh, you could easily look back and see heartbreak and failure. But in my life, I really kind of treasure the fact that not only do I think I benefited from these relationships,
Mhm.
but I liked reading about, the women I knew also
That
enjoyed
is
the time. And
that is such a great concept. I mean, you're really flipping things. I've had lots of conversations about how we measure success and how important it is to not associate certain material objects and income with how we perceive ourselves in success. And that's something what you just said is really kind of throwing me in a very positive way that it's whatever relationship you have, whether it's um, romantic or not, even friendships, understanding that success doesn't mean length or longevity. I wonder if that's really what your book is about, recognizing what success looks like and defining it for yourself and then living it and double checking and looking back to make sure that you were living it so you don't face regret later.
well, there's a couple things there. I mean, you and I had a conversation, I think, on Mount Helena where we talked a little bit about uh, storytelling,
Mhm.
your thing, and it was interesting. It was timely because I had just finished a draft of this whole manuscript, and I'm in the process of kind of whittling it down, cutting,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it's twice as long as it should be. My stories are
That's
not that
usually the
good.
case. No, that's usually the case when you start. It's way better to start with too much than to have to fill things in.
Well, I hope you're right. And the but I as you finish and you kind of come back to where you started when you've written a book, you start to kind of see your messages, or you ask yourself, if I did this for my son, what are your messages? What are my messages for my son George? And what in this body of text, what's coming to the surface? What did you start with and what did you end with? And as far as living my life, there was no grand design. I assure you of that.
Right.
It, decades before mindfulness, I was living in the moment. That's for sure. I lived for the day. I lived paycheck to paycheck. I didn't even know that was a negative thing until I was like 40 years old and someone was talking about it. And I thought back and I didn't even know there was another way to live other than paycheck to paycheck. I spent everything. I didn't have jobs where there was a lot of extra, you know, savings, and I was always buying the next international air ticket because that's
Right.
something. No matter how how renowned you were as a climber or how much success you were having as a climber, no one pays for your airfare, at least back in those days. And so, you know, I ran a zero balance and lived in the moment. Uh, but as you say, in writing, I mean, I've learned a lot looking back on how I lived my life, and uh, it's been it's been kind of, I guess, a little reaffirming or refreshing because,
Mhm.
with the help of the documentation and kind of sifting through it, um, I think there's something there, not only for my son, but for people my age who, might wonder what it might have been if they hadn't locked in on all the stability and followed the dominant paradigm from the beginning.
When we talked on Mount Helena, we took a short hike together. Well, it wasn't too short. It was actually pretty good hike.
Mhm.
What I think about is when you were telling me about the book and writing it, and I remember asking you, "Well, who do you want to read it? And why what do you want them to get out of it? And do you have an idea about how you want people to feel or what you want them to think about when they've finished reading your book?" And one of the things you said is that you were really writing it for you to put together this almost a linear um, representation of your wild and very adventurous life. And it sounds like there are really two things here that you're working toward and acknowledging. And one is it is partly for your son, not just so that he can see what his dad did and what you accomplished and where your struggles were, but also so that he sees himself in those adventures and chooses with intention versus obliviousness and then potentially regret. And then the other side of this might be encouraging people to carry a journal or pay attention to that correspondence, print out the emails in case you might lose electronic connection, right? Um, that's what I'm hearing is those stories matter to and not just to you.
Right, right. I was working with a coach in DC in 2011. I'd been looking for work there without success, and I decided to hire a coach, a personal coach, and she got me writing. And it was a good fit. And going back, I have documentation of this as well.
Of
Going back,
course.
I read what the intake interview with her was, where she asked, is there anything you haven't done in your life that you'd like to do? Maybe it's a standard thing for coaches to ask that to clients. But I said, no, if from this point backwards, that's what I've been doing. I don't have any bucket list now. When something would come up that I wanted to do, I went and did it.
Right.
If it was snowboarding off a volcano in Ecuador, if it was leaving my desk job in the attorney general's office and going to teach sea kayaking in Chile, I did that. So I arrived at like in a 50-55, having already done a lot of that stuff. But here are some things I would like to do. And the first thing on that list was writing my stories. Uh, and
Mhm.
and so I forgot about that. And a friend who's kind of in the publishing business told me about 5 years ago, Gio, I think you have a book in you. You should try it. Have you thought about doing that? And all of a sudden it kind of clicked. All those boxes, all those photos, the magazine articles I've already written about climbing. I'd like to bring it all together. And and so initially it was kind of uh, that was the inspiration, the motivation. But soon I saw that this was going to be valuable for George, my son,
Mhm.
and just for sure. I mean, there'd be no question because I'd be telling stories. For example, you know, why did the circumstances of his birth? my relationship with his mother, uh, my relationship with his mother after his birth, the dissolution, but I stayed in his life till he was 7. We continued to do things. All those kind of, from the father's perspective, I knew it would be good for him.
Mhm.
And it was really um, only after I wrote the thing that I realized this will be better if you have some themes for not only your son, but for, say, his generation. Because,
Yes.
for example, one thing I did, which is really unusual, and there was no name for it back in the day, was that I just took a year here, a year there, a year after grad school, a year before law school, a year after law school. Now they're called gap years. But but back then it was
Sabbaticals.
just, yeah, my dad called it dropping out. You know, he actually cut me off when I was a sophomore in college because I took a year to travel around the United States in a van with a friend. But I didn't consider that, I was kind of looking for a different school to go. Anyway, the value of gap years, for example, is just that rings throughout
Mhm.
this manuscript. And the extended times in nature. I mean, again,
Mhm.
that short time we spent together on Mount Helena, you mentioned this book by Michael Easter, The Crisis of Comfort.
Uh-huh.
And there's a guy that's talking about these expeditions to Alaska. And
Mhm.
I wasn't really that enamored by the hunting aspect of it, but he spent time in nature and then he documents and presents all the science how people that spend extended time in nature, whether it's even just a 4-day backpacking trip in the Spanish Peaks or a 5-week Knowles course or
Right.
3 months in the Himalaya, the calmness, the quality, the benefit of that is incredible. I felt it. I wrote about it. I had I have paragraphs about that that will probably be cut, but
No,
Michael
don't cut
Easter,
that part.
yeah, I got to weave it together with Michael
Uh,
Easter
seriously, I'm
because
so glad you read it after we talked about that.
yeah, that was timely too. It was there's a lot of serendipity, in my life, and so another thing that kind of comes through looking at a kind of 40,000-foot level is that when you're unemployed or when you're taking those gap years, or let's say you have a good job and you're going, you're moving up, you have a corner office, everything is looking good, whether it's public service or private. But if for any reason, like you get the wild hair that there's a wild wilder or a larger world out there and you leave that and you go on kind of like a midlife walkabout. I did this when I was 45 for 2 years. The benefits of something like that uh, are enormous. When you're unemployed and you're not working, or you're working, you're underemployed. Let's say you're just working 3 months of the year teaching kayaking. That gives you the time to live frugally, and you know it's amazing how how less you can consume and have a
Mhm.
fuller life. Yeah.
Absolutely. The priorities shift. I remember moving from Washington, D.C. to Montana. That alone was like, oh, what I really want to do is spend time with my kids. I don't want to spend an hour in the car each way to and from work. And we took a huge pay cut moving here. I'm telling you, I gave up my job and my husband took a $10,000 pay cut, and our cost of living did not go down that much. So I agree. And the other thing that is coming to mind is this idea that your book can not just guide people to take those gaps, but also to encourage people older to look at what is something you want to do that you haven't done yet. And what kind of story can you create to share with other people, to inspire them, to share with your kids, to remind them that life isn't all what society seems to designate as success, right? When you said about the gap year, that was something I took a gap year, and I just did the air quotes for those of you that aren't watching the video. Um, I when I dropped out, we called it dropping out, of course, because it was in the late '80s, early '90s, and when our younger son did that, he was going to the University of Montana, and he took a gap year, and he took a gap semester, and then he took another gap semester, and the whole time, all I could say was, "You go. You go travel, you live somewhere else, you do what you need to do." First of all, I'm not paying for anything when you're traveling. This cost me less because I was paying for your tuition and fees. But he's completely independent. He's always had his own job, his own income. So when he wasn't in school, he was paying all his own expenses. When he was in school, I paid tuition and fees. So all I could say was, if I don't want to waste my money and I don't want you to waste your time, if this isn't what you want to be doing right now, when you're ready, the money will be there. And
Right.
I did tell him, well, remember that when I did it, we called it dropping out, but you can call it a gap year if you want.
Right. Well, I'll have to remember that for George's mother, um, because yeah, those kind of benefits. George now wants to read what I've written, and so that's good. And you know, will I may satisfy my goal of doing something that he can learn from, or giving him something that will tell him about his father in probably more detail than you ever want to know. But yeah, I do know that, like, just today I was talking with a woman in Montana who is not my age, 72, but I think 68. And she was saying how she had this kind of her dream for 2026 was renting a van and driving from northern Argentina down to the tip, where she had a friend who would meet her kind of probably for some of that classic backpacking down there in the Torres de Paine or something. But the people she had talked to about this proposal, or this idea she had said, "You shouldn't go alone." And I kind of countered that right away. I mean, I'm not really familiar with northern Argentina, and anytime you get close to a border, like up there near Peru, it could get sketchy. But uh, I'm traveling around by myself all the time, and I'm seeing women travel by themselves more and more. 10 years ago, not. But this summer, even in sketchy parts of northern Idaho, I ran into where no one was in the campground because it was early May, just me and another woman, like in a van. We didn't talk to each other. I mean, she was cautious, but I'm seeing that now. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if kind of my tales of being 72 and still climbing with my son, or even doing something as wild as migrating or immigrating to Colombia. If I can do it, they can do it.
Mhm. That is such a great reminder for people. So I just would love to you have so many interesting stories about your travels, so I don't wanna keep I don't wanna leave all of that out. So I'd love to hear at least one story of one of your adventures that you mentioned. Was it snowboarding off a volcano? Is that what you said? I wanna hear
Yeah.
that story. What was that about?
Oh boy. Uh, you know, in in my life, I mean, I mean, I've discussed this in the terms of love and relationships. In that, sometimes the richest story, um, from my perspective, just me personally, are the ones where the love is unconsummated or unfulfilled. And it's my male friends don't like those stories, but uh, there's just something kind of pure, and you have a chance encounter. Maybe you're hitchhiking, you get picked up by a young woman tennis player from Bozeman State who has brownies in the back, invites you to spend the night in Bozeman, but you're trying to get to a fundraiser in Missoula where your friends are going to dance, and you elect to continue on your journey.
Ah,
So you never see her again. You don't know her name. It was just a momentary thing. It's like unfulfilled, you know. Uh,
there's something very
it's
romantic
it's
about that.
it's a
The
it's a
the
friendship.
possibility, right?
Yeah. So
Possibility. The
yeah,
what ifs.
some of those stories are I enjoy them the most. I had success, but it's sometimes the other side of that coin is just as rich, if not richer. So getting back to the snowboarding off the volcano, uh, and I have snowboarded off peaks my entire life, but I had designs to snowboard off Cotopaxi in Ecuador. And I was actually, this was during my walkabout. I was 46. I wasn't a young man. And uh, I peaked physically right at 30, just like any other athlete, professional athlete. You're just not running the 100-meter dash like you were when you were 24, 22. Anyway, but I carried my snowboards down to Ecuador. I was going to Spanish school in Quito, where they have great intensive Spanish. And I studied diligently because my school, the National Outdoor Leadership School, Knowles, that was hiring me for Mexico and Chile, they paid for the schooling just so if something came up in an emergency, I could talk to the Coast Guard or whatever and negotiate
Sure.
some kind of evacuation. So I was studying Spanish, but I brought my ice axe, my crampons. Cotopaxi is like I don't know, it's probably like 19 or 20,000 feet tall. It's right outside of Quito. You look at it every day. And I decided to climb. That was my goal, was to get up Cotopaxi solo and to snowboard down. Uh, and I ended up writing a detailed story about this.
Oh,
I,
good.
I, I tried to sell it. It didn't sell. And I didn't really know how to sell that kind of story, I think, in retrospect. But what ended up happening was that I got up there with my snowboard, with my crampons. I climbed on ice all day. Since I was a solo American and everything on those peaks is guided by Ecuadorians, it's Ecuadorians' business. It's kind of like when you travel now, it's in vogue to go local, to
Right.
uh, eco
Sure.
travel. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But if you're just a independent climber, you don't want to hire a guide. I didn't need a guide on that. There's crevasses. I knew where those were, the Bergstrom's up near the top. But from the lodge at 18,000 feet all the way up that thing, I met resistance by the men on the peak, the men and some of the women guides as well. And I carried my board on ice. I was carrying this thing. It's like I must have had hypoxia because I just looking at what I was climbing, I knew I couldn't snowboard it. It wouldn't, even if I did snowboard it, it would not be enjoyable. It's like
Right, right. It's all ice. Right.
East Coast skiing, East Coast skiing.
Oh, I know what that is. No, thank you.
There's a reason we live in Montana and go to the
Yeah,
Great Divide.
and
Uh,
Colorado skiing, yep.
yeah, but the guides, when I got up to the Bergschrund, they had a ladder across the Bergschrund, and I had heard there were some problems with the ladder getting across this Bergschrund. But when I got up there, it was like 19.5. Boards are heavy. I was gassed, but I had enough in the tank to get to the top. They said the Bergschrund was closed. The ladder was full. And so I had to do this traverse around to the west side of Cotopaxi by myself. No one was around there. There was a trail, but no one was going up that way. And I managed to get up to the summit dome. I didn't quite summit it because I started to feel kind of vulnerable being alone and at high altitude. So I retraced my steps and came back down to below the Bergschrund. And the Ecuadorian guides, there was a team coming down of clients, and they had crossed the Bergschrund on the ladder. Bergschrund is a big crevasse that's open right near the rock, near the top. And so it's like they had, I don't know if I can swear on here, but they had screwed me over and closed it selectively just to prevent me from having a success. I down climbed. On the way down, I had trouble with my crampons. I actually carried that board all the way up Cotopaxi, carried it all the way down,
Oh, no.
and never put it on my. I never strapped
Put
on
it
my
on.
board. So that's my that's my unrequited love and my unrequited
That's such
summoning.
a good story. You know what I'm imagining? And I would be happy to talk about this with you at another time offline, but, I'm imagining this as a coffee table book. I'm serious, because you have pictures, you have all this documentation, you have, the correspondence. You could make it almost like a scrapbook with images and make like a big coffee table book with the pictures. I think that would be so cool because then you could do individual stories. I mean, this would obviously come from your biography. You could pull the stories that you have great detail about and just build like a 40-page coffee table book that people could just turn and read one story at a time. How cool would that be? I would totally read that.
Cut the text even more. Uh, yeah, I don't think the text is gonna do it for this book. You're absolutely right. It's not the stories. My younger brother used to joke about my slideshows I give in public, and he would say he had a song. He would sing. He goes, "Pitch 21, same as pitch 20. Pitch 22, same as pitch 21," and they were boring. Climbing stories are boring, and they're tedious. Uh, it's being it's so easy for me now to be cutting the climbing out of this draft. But some of these other things I've learned, personal things, and especially if there's any, uh, especially if there's any humor that can be
Sure.
told.
Mhm.
That's what. That's why people will turn the page.
Absolutely, and what came to me was those stories where everything went right, those aren't nearly as interesting as the things that go sideways, and I used to help people plan weddings. I worked for a hotel, I did catering for years when I was in DC, and the first few years I was in Montana, and I would tell the bride and the mother of the bride who would be, like, so stressed about everything being perfect, and I would say, "It's the things that go sideways that make it memorable."
There you
If
go.
your wedding
There
goes
you go.
without a hitch, people aren't really gonna remember it. But if something goes a little sideways, like at my wedding, my grandmother we had 3 out of 4 of our grandmothers at our wedding, and my grandmother, had broken her hip just 2 weeks before the wedding. So she had to have a special, taxi come get her at the rehab facility because she was in a wheelchair, she couldn't walk. So the special wheelchair accessible taxi picked her up in Rockville, Maryland, drove her to Old Town Alexandria, Virginia, and she was, like, more than half an hour late, and I would not start without her, and my mom said, "Sarah, everybody's waiting, you have to start," and I just looked at her and I said, "You can't start without the bride." And I am not walking until she gets here. Needless to say, I had actually had way too much to drink. So I I'm not sure I would have been quite so relaxed had I not been plied with alcohol before the wedding. And I will never forget standing at the end of our wedding when the rabbi said, "Go greet your people," in saying hi to my in-laws and hugs and kisses, and then walking to the reception. But when he said that, I turned around and just started walking down by myself. And my husband grabbed me by the elbow and he said, "You need to go meet my father." And I smiled sweetly and said, "I know your father."
Troublemaker.
That's when he realized that I should not have had that last glass of wine. Anyway, yes, it's the things that go sideways. That's why your Cotopaxi story is the one that I want to read with pictures. Yeah, most climbing stories all sound the same. until something goes sideways and you have to figure it out, or somebody intentionally screws you up. Because now it's funny.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We had some terrific arguments on the way up some of my hardest and most successful climbs. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Gio, when you think about this book, and our listeners, I'm sure, will be looking forward to it. I'll be sure to share it along with this episode in the future when you get it out there one way or another. Um, you have this group of listeners right now that are so curious about the book. They want to learn more. What's something you want them to know before they read the book?
Uh, boy, that's a good one. Um, I think it's not very sexy. It's really difficult to make interesting. People are so shut down on policy and changing things and government and whatnot. But I worked in government. I was an attorney for politicians. I I worked for Republicans and Democrats in Oregon and in Montana and in the White House actually. You know, I have hope that the process can right itself. The process will uh, balance itself. I have included some of my stories. I feel even though I had a good time, I was as my wife learned at my wedding. I was an expert at having fun. Those around me had fun as well. Uh, my law school classmates remember the parties that a friend of mine and I threw. Uh, we had memorable parties in this in Helena, governor's balls, Halloween parties, dressing in drag. I mean, there's a lot of fun to be had, and those stories I told. But I've also tried to tell about some of, I guess I'd call it just the cleaning up that I got to do as an environmental lawyer while I was inside the system, making things just a little bit better. And,
Mm.
even though it took 9 years of school, I was only in it for about 13 years. I didn't make, the career of it that some people do. I had some victories, and I've tried to outline those and describe them because they show what, if you have kind of a conscience and you accept the responsibility of maybe being in a corner office. It can be a corner office in a corporation. Maybe you're the CFO, maybe you're the counsel, uh, maybe you're just the head of HR, but you're in there with the CEO, or you're in there with the attorney general, you're in there with the deputy chief of staff. And it's kind of like using your position to help the public interest will make your retirement so more satisfying than the 401k and having all the zeros in your bank account or the real estate. And it was kind of my life lesson. Uh, I'm really enjoying life now, and so I hope people hold on and realize that we'll get it together. We've got time. This generation, my son's generation, they have the time. They could make the planet sustainable.
Mm. That's a good, hopeful way to wrap this up.
Yeah.
Yes, let's go. Let's make this world better. Gio, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a treat. I knew it would be, and I really appreciate your time and efforts.
Well, I'm really pleased Chip introduced us, and good luck in your work, your podcast, your storytelling, and TED Talks. Go get them, girl.
Thank you.
Okay.
Listeners, now it's your turn. First, I highly recommend you check out Michael Easter's book, The Comfort Crisis. There will be a link to that book in the show notes associated with this podcast episode. And in the future, I promise to update you when George's book is finally released. Who knows when that'll be, but I'm sure it will be well worth the wait. And now I'm going to ask you the hard question. What's something that you want to accomplish? What's something you want to do in your life that you haven't yet done, that you can take a step today, tomorrow, the next day toward that idea that you've been thinking about for years? Don't wait. We're not guaranteed tomorrow. Make sure people who are in your life know that those relationships are meaningful. Tell them and take that step. Thanks for listening.
That's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.